Welcome back. Multiple outlets are reporting that the Saudi government is preparing to acknowledge that journalist Jamal Khashoggi died in an interrogation. It is important to note that the sourcing by these news organizations is anonymous, and NBC News, or at least unnamed, we should say, and NBC News doesn't have it confirmed on our end at this point. But President Trump was just asked about these reports, and he did not offer a confirmation.
We'll see. I heard that report, but nobody knows if it's an official report. So far, it's just the rumor of a report coming out.
Earlier today, the president suggested, quote, rogue killers were responsible for what happened to Khashoggi. And so far, he has been reluctant to punish Saudi Arabia with retribution, like, I don't know, cutting arms sales.
I tell you what I don't want to do. Boeing, Lockheed, Raytheon, all these I don't want to hurt jobs. I don't want to lose an order like that. There are other ways of punishing, to use a word that's a pretty harsh word, but it's true.
I'm joined now by Nick Kristof, columnist for the New York Times, who wrote a piece over the weekend about Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman titled, "If a Prince Murders a Journalist, That's Not a Hiccup." And Washington Post national security correspondent Shane Harris, who's been following this story. The president, Nick, has been, as we just said, reluctant to do anything too harsh on Saudi Arabia. There's talk about how he's saying that there's going to be something very strong will happen if he finds out it's true. But the strongest thing that many people can think of is trying to cut back on this arms deal, which Donald Trump also is mischaracterizing.
That's right. I mean, look, I think it was pathetic the way we enabled the Saudi government and the Crown Prince before this happened and led him to believe that he could get away with almost anything. And that's not just the administration. He's got plenty of company in the U.S. And I think then after the murder of Jamal, then it's pathetic that he's unwilling to talk about curbing weapons sales, about expelling ambassadors, even about keeping our Treasury Secretary from going to Riyadh. And this is such a breach of international norms. And the idea now that Saudi Arabia may set up a fall guy to claim this is some kind of rogue operation, this is like O.J. Simpson looking for the killer.
It seems a bit odd because they've been denying it repeatedly. So if the reports are true that they're going to try and find a way to confirm it, that would be interesting. I wonder if there's any consequences for them outright denying it and then confirming it. But it's also important to know what the evidence shows so far. And what we know is that Jamal Khashoggi is on surveillance video, Shane, walking into the Saudi consulate in Turkey. And there is no surveillance video of him walking out. NBC News has reporting that he looked at his text messages before he got into the Saudi consulate. There's a read receipt. Once he was in the Saudi consulate, he has not seen a single text message. So the evidence that we know of, we can confirm, is right there. The president, Shane, presumably has access to a lot more intelligence than any of us do. And today he threw out rogue actors. I assume if there was any evidence of rogue actors, he'd offer it after he said that.
Or he might not. I mean, it's not entirely clear to me why he's suddenly coming up with this rogue killers, rogue actors
Unless he's just making it up, like the 400-pound man in his basement that hacked the election.
It's possibly the rogue killer is the new 400-pound man, right? And we're sort of verging from skepticism into denialism like it has been with Russia. It's also interesting that he says that, and now we're hearing reports, which we have not confirmed at the Washington Post, that the Saudis may about to describe something that looks a lot like rogue operation. And, of course, the president did talk to King Salman this morning, not long before he went out on the White House lawn and made the comment about rogue killers. I mean, you mentioned the evidence that there is from the texts, from the surveillance cameras. It's been our reporting as well that the Turks have told American intelligence officials they have audio recording. And it's my understanding from talking to some sources today that I think that that's a view that the United States probably is prepared to believe that the Turks have that. It's not clear that they've handed anything over. So we're in this interesting point where the Turks may have some kind of more definitive information about what happened inside the consulate. It's not entirely clear they've sent that over to the Americans so that the Americans can independently try to corroborate it. But now the president is going out publicly and offering a theory about what happened while we're getting reports of a Saudi theory about to emerge. So it's a mess, really. And what we haven't really seen is a definitive answer from any side about what happened to this journalist.
But this falls into a pattern, Nick, of the way that Donald Trump embraces dictators, the way he embraces leaders who have histories of very severe human rights violations. Vladimir Putin, which he acknowledged in that 60 Minutes interview last night. Kim Jong-un, which he was forced to acknowledge in that 60 Minutes interview last night when Leslie Stahl presented him with the list of things that he did. And now we have MBS. I mean, it's no secret that there's some very serious human rights violations in Saudi Arabia.
Impunity has consequences. You let leaders know that they can do worse. And I think that's what happened in the case of MBS. My fear is that right now it may well be in the interest of Saudi Arabia, of Turkey, and the U.S. to agree on some kind of a fall guy who did this.
Why?
So, to protect Saudi Arabia, to protect the Crown Prince. It's certainly in Saudi Arabia's interest to find some
Why would it
fall
be
guy.
in Turkey's interest,
Because
given how strong Turkey has been in saying that this is Saudi Arabia's fault?
Because Turkey doesn't want to rupture relations with Saudi Arabia, so that if they can find some face-saving way to show that, yes, there was a killing, it happened in the consulate, but that this wasn't necessarily MBS. If they can prevent that rupture, that would, I think Erdogan would welcome that. And I think certainly Trump would welcome that. And yet it just flies in the face of everything we know. I mean, this wasn't a rogue operation. The second plane left Saudi Arabia too soon for them to have known that Khashoggi had died. And so what we have is a crown prince who got away with provoking a crisis with Qatar, who got away with kidnapping the Lebanese prime minister, who got away with imprisoning women's rights activists, and got away with starving 8 million Yemenis. He got away with all that, and so he thought he could get away with killing a prominent journalist. And it looks like he may indeed.
A crown prince who's billed himself and tried to bill himself as a progressive in the Saudi Arabian sense, a moderator in the Saudi Arabian sense.
He snookered us. You know, he snookered the Trump administration. He also snookered an awful lot of Americans. I think he talked about the arms deal. He promised $110 billion in arms buys. It isn't anything close to that, not remotely like that. I think also that a lot of people
There's promissory notes saying that at some point he might buy those arms, and it would be 2024, 2032.
That's right. But it's not, it's certainly not money on the table. And I think there were a lot of people who really wanted a Middle East peace deal and thought that he might deliver that. And so they suspended their rationality on this.
Interesting. I mean, the president didn't bring up Middle East peace when he was talking about why he would be reluctant to punish Saudi Arabia. He brought up the arms deal. But when you're looking at the larger role of Saudi Arabia in Middle East peace, there's a lot of reporting that's out there about Jared Kushner's relationship with MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, and what he was hoping he would do for Jared Kushner for his Middle East peace plan, his plan for peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Shane.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Mohammed bin Salman and Jared Kushner, they are sort of where the relationship right now between the U.S. and the Saudis on a senior policy level, where that meets. And Jared Kushner really kind of put all of his chips on Mohammed bin Salman and spent a lot of time trying to persuade intelligence and national security officials that MBS was someone that they could trust and they could deal with. That runs totally counter to conversations I had been having since before Mohammed bin Salman even became the crown prince with U.S. intelligence officials who eyed him very warily. They saw his rise to power as something very swift, quite ruthless, and believed that Jared Kushner was naive to be trusting this person. And when you throw into the mix potential business conflicts of interest between Kushner companies and the Trump organization, that's caused this profound anxiety, I think, within the national security community about why it is that the senior advisor to the president continues to have this relationship with the crown prince that nobody with any experience in the government in this region thinks is a good idea.
Could say the same about Donald Trump's relationship with Vladimir Putin, too, I guess. Shane Harris. Shane, thank you very much. And Nick Kristof, always good to see you. Thank you.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press Mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.